Could start moving our seats. We'll start in about 5 minutes. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Alabama World Affairs Council. It's great to be getting together again. I want to thank everybody for coming out. We had some competition. I have to tell you, we were just talking about this. Originally, we were going to do this on Tuesday last night. The reason we didn't is next door in the Davis Theater would have been the magic of Motown. And I would love to have done this all with a Motown soundtrack. However, I think it would have been a little bit hard to compete with them, and the parking would definitely have been an issue. So I know today is Air Force birthday, September 8th. Off we go. Yay. But and so I know we lost some people because of events associated with that, but I appreciate everybody coming out. Let me just take a moment to preview the fall season for Alabama World Affairs Council presentations. First of all, tonight, and more to come on that, Dr. Jacob Lassin on essentially the role of religion in the Russo-Ukraine war that we're seeing right now. A fascinating presentation, as I'm sure you'll agree. Now, we have a special free event at the end of the month in conjunction with Troy University. And that's on September 29th, which is a Sunday at 3 p.m. And it's going to be right next door in the Davis Theater. And it's going to be the presentation of a documentary film called Beyond a War. And it's a fascinating documentary, not a long film, but it's about reconciliation and essentially between Dr. Jack Hawkins, whom I'm sure you know is a chancellor of Troy University, Vietnam veteran, and one of the people he actually fought against, now a university president in Vietnam. And it's about their journey toward reconciliation in that history. And we're going to have actually the director is going to be here. So a fascinating panel discussion will accompany this film, and I'm going to be the MC. So I promise I'll be brief. So I encourage you to join us for that September 29th, Sunday afternoon, 3 p.m. Next door at the Davis Theater. Then on October 22nd, Dr. Elizabeth Pfeiffer on extremist groups and information warfare. That'll be here again. And then November 19th, Dr. Christopher Colley on Chinese influence in the Pacific region. I was just talking to Bowen, and boy, the China situation is one that merits a lot more attention. So that'll be fascinating from that perspective. I want to thank those of you who have paid your dues. It always comes due in September. The best way to do it is always online if you can. Just alwac.org. Log into your membership profile. You can pay with a credit card right there. Makes it simple. But we really need the funding. Everything, as you know, with inflation has gone up. Catering has gone up. We actually are now, because of doing our Zoom and the other things, we've renegotiated with Troy University. And again, we get a great bargain with them here, but we are going to have to pay a setup fee and help provide for the audio visual and Zoom. So we have that, and then our other costs through the contracts that we have with Dottie and with Jeremy, it all adds up. So to get those great speakers, we need you need your contributions. Your memberships need to think about upping to the next level on the membership, if you will. Because we want to not just bring in take full advantage of our local talent here at Air University and Troy University, but we also want to bring in those big speakers from Council on Foreign Relations, Brookings, the Atlantic Council, you name it. So, and that's a little more expensive, although we generally cap the honoraria at $1,000. And a lot of people are willing to take that. We still have to pay for travel and hotel, which is pretty expensive. So having hosting those bigger names takes a little bit more. So please think about helping us, or even just saying, hey, I'll sponsor, one of those and make a contribution specifically towards that. Happy to talk with you about that. With that, let me introduce, and very happy to have Dr. Jacob Lassin here tonight, who is an assistant professor of regional and cultural studies with an emphasis on Russia. He's a New Jersey native, went to William and Mary, which is where my oldest daughter went. And while he was at William and Mary, decided to focus especially on Russian, learn Russian, spent time in St. Petersburg, spent time later on in Ufa. Is that right? Okay, I haven't been there yet. But it's fascinating kind of say. And then he ultimately received his PhD from Yale University in Slavic literatures and cultures in 2019. Fascinating research focus. It's really, as you'll see from this, the intersection of religion, politics, literature, and new media in Russia and the Soviet Union. Currently working on a book project, Sacred Sites, Russian Orthodox Cultural Politics Online, which explores how websites run by the Russian Orthodox Church and its allies reinterpret Russian culture to attract a new educated elite that supports the church and the state. Now, in addition to what he's doing here at Air University, he's held postdoctoral fellowships at the Havinghurst Center for Russian, Eurasian, and Eastern European Studies at Miami University of Ohio, Oxford, I believe, Ohio. The Malikian Center for Russian, Eurasian, and East European Studies at Arizona State University, and the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Jacob Lassin.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for the very warm introduction and for the wonderful invitation to be here with you all tonight. Can everyone hear me okay? Am I speaking? Great. Excellent. Jeremy, are you going to put up the... Great. Fantastic. Great. So before I begin, I just need to, I have to do this disclaimer now because of my new job, that these views are my own and do not reflect the official policy position of the Department of Defense, Air University, or the US government. So thank you again, I really appreciate it. So today I'm going to be speaking about the role of religion in Russia's current war against Ukraine. And religion is a key element to the larger cultural context and justifications that Putin has given for the invasion. I'm going to provide you with some historical background regarding religion in these countries. Okay. And connect that history with what we've been seeing happening in the war since 2022. The majority of my talk today is going to focus on the role of Orthodox Christianity because it is the dominant religion in both countries, but I will comment on the impact of other religious traditions as well. Now, under Russian law specifically, 4 religions are recognized as traditional for different segments of the population. And those 4 are Orthodoxy, Sunni Islam, Judaism, and Tibetan Buddhism. So there are aspects of these 4 communities that get certain benefits under Russian law, and as a result, other groups are excluded from certain things. For example, each of those 4 groups are allowed to teach kind of courses on morality and on ethical culture in schools, whereas no other religious groups are allowed to. So that's just how that kind of official traditional religion works. So if we can, oh great, perfect. So I know that many Americans do not have much familiarity with Orthodoxy. And as I've now worked for the military, there's 2 things that the military, or I guess 1 thing. No, it's 2. 2 things that the military and the Orthodox Church love more than anything: acronyms and jargon. So these are some of the acronyms I'm going to be using throughout tonight. And then, of course, this really important term at the bottom. So ROC, Russian Orthodox Church, UOC, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, not to be confused with the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. I'll get into that in a second. It's very much a kind of Life of Brian situation there. Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, but the most important is that term autocephalous. And autocephalous literally means self-headed. And that's the term used within Orthodoxy to talk about a church that has its own governing structure and is an independent, full-fledged kind of member of the council of churches that makes up the Orthodox Church around the world. I can go to the next slide, please. So Orthodoxy and Catholicism split around 1,000 years ago. The date usually given is 1054. And the major difference between the two is how leadership and decision-making are structured. So in Catholicism, right, there's a pope. He's the supreme authority over governance in the church. He's the supreme legislator. Whatever he says goes. In Orthodoxy, the structure is rather different, as you can see here. There is no one bishop who is over all the others. Rather, the Orthodox Church is divided into various local autocephalous churches. So that's why you have things like the Greek Orthodox Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, the Russian Orthodox Church. And of course, not all of them recognize each other all the time. So you see that last column there, the Orthodox Church in America and the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, which we're going to talk a lot about, are both only partially recognized. So that is a sticking point as well for a lot of these communities. Now, to make a decision that affects the entirety of Orthodox Christians, they have to come together in a council and agree on things with some kind of consensus or unanimity. And this hasn't happened for centuries. There is the figure of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. He's seen as kind of the primus inter pares, the first among equals, within the Orthodox communion, but he is not, again, the Pope. He is just another member. He might have some precedence. He might get to speak first, get to sit at the head of the table, but he is not in charge. He doesn't have any extra executive power. Next slide, please. So the Russian Orthodox Church itself traces its roots back to the year 988, when Grand Prince Vladimir, next slide, please, was baptized in Crimea. And so who you see here are two depictions of Vladimir. On the left, we have him in a statue that was erected outside the Kremlin walls in 2016. And on the right is a 19th century depiction of him being baptized in Crimea. And so the origin story of Christianity in what is now Ukraine and Russia is of extreme importance to what's going on today. So at the time of Prince Vladimir's baptism, Moscow didn't exist. And it didn't exist for another 200 or so years until after he died. So a lot of Ukrainians make fun of this giant statue being put up kind of as a vanity project for Putin, right? Same name. And them trying to basically take over Ukrainian identity and history. Vladimir himself ruled over a polity that is today known to historians as Kiev on Rus, because it was centered on Kiev. But this is not the same thing as Russia. Rather, it was a loose confederation of East Slavic principalities that are the historical antecedents of today's Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So initially, the church in these lands was based in Kiev. But over time, power and prestige shifted from Kiev to Moscow, and what is now the Russian Orthodox Church has been based there for about 400 years. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church and Russia have often seen themselves in a kind of messianic role because of its seat of power and because of the strength that Russia developed over the centuries. There's a well-known formulation that comes out of the Russian religious tradition from a monk in the 1600s that Moscow is the third Rome and there shall be no fourth. So this idea derives from the idea that the first Rome fell to the barbarians and then apostatized with Catholicism. The second Rome, Constantinople, fell to the Ottomans and therefore was no longer the seat of a great empire. And so now all of the religious authority has been shifted to Moscow. And so that is where kind of history ends in a sense. And this is going to be the empire that leads us till kingdom come. So this ideology has been a key motivating factor in how the church has approached its relationship with the state, and how the Russian government has often conceived of its role and its mission in the world. This messianic streak can be seen directly in today's Ruski Mir, or Russian world ideology, which is an explicit idea that Russia has a responsibility and an obligation to protect and to intervene on behalf of ethnic Russians wherever they may be around the world. So they could be anywhere within kind of the former Soviet sphere or beyond that. And we see that directly in what's happening in Ukraine today. So the Russian Orthodox Church is by far the largest Orthodox church around the world. It accounts for roughly half of all Orthodox Christians on the planet. And during the Soviet period, the church was highly regulated and repressed. In fact, we know now from archival research that most of the bishops and priests at the time were KGB informants, including the patriarch today. The church received a great deal of support and benefits from the state after the end of the Soviet Union, though, because it was seen as a kind of bridging institution, something that could connect the people to this new post-Soviet period that kind of skip over the Soviet period, bring us back to the history and culture that was seen beforehand. And also when you no longer had the kind of ideological engine that was Marxist-Leninism within the Soviet Union, in the new Russia, you needed something else to kind of fill that void. So that's where a lot of that support for the church came into force. There's been a huge uptick in the building of churches and other church-related buildings. Clergy are prominent in the public sphere. You see them all over television and radio. And there are many moments when politicians look to gain symbolic support from the church. You will never see a major holiday pass without Putin going to a church service. And for all of this support for the church, we've not seen a real increase in actual religious observance. So while about 80% of Russians identify as Orthodox, only about 2% ever go to church with any regularity. But all in all, the church is still seen generally positively and as a kind of cornerstone of Putin's larger cultural politics. The church has also received special legal protections and certain kinds of benefits from its allyship with the state. The government passed a law that made it illegal to offend the sensibilities of believers. And that's as vague as the law actually is. It's purposefully vague so that it's meant to use to maximally punish any and all behaviors that might offend or even be distasteful to religious believers. For example, the law was used to prosecute a teenage YouTuber who recorded a video of himself playing Pokemon Go in an otherwise empty church. So while the Russian Orthodox Church has reaped a great deal of benefits from its relationship with the government, the situation for religious freedom in Russia is actually rather bleak. A few years ago, the Jehovah's Witnesses organization was declared an extremist terrorist organization and formally banned in the country. Some members of the group have been arrested with hefty jail sentences. The same and the exact same kinds of locations they're being sent to and the same sentences they're getting are what you would give to a terrorist. So the Russian Orthodox Church, in addition, has been a willing partner. Could you skip 2 ahead, actually? A willing partner to practically all of the state's actions with regard to the media, with regard to the war. There's been criticism of the church for blessing nuclear weapons and ICBMs, and of promoting militarism in the dedication of a new cathedral dedicated to the armed forces. This picture on the left is a mosaic from that cathedral. It was dedicated specifically to the victors in World War II. And it got in, there was a little bit of a controversy because initially they were going to have a mosaic to Stalin, but that was quashed because too many people complained. But there is a lot of kind of this idea that Russia has been blessed in its military activities and that it's kind of all of its military actions have this kind of divine tinge to them. The church has staunchly defended the war against Ukraine, with the patriarch even referring to it as a holy war. Moreover, the patriarch has given extensive justifications for the war. For instance, in a sermon given soon after the invasion, he stated that Russia had to invade because the people of Eastern Ukraine were being subjected to gay pride parades, and that the Christian faith itself was under attack. Russia has often used these kind of homophobic rhetoric to slander opponents and to fearmonger among its population. And often this is turned on the West. So for example, you'll see Europe referred to a lot of times as Gay-ropa instead of Europa in the Russian media. The use of this tactic in conjunction with the invasion of Ukraine was a strong rallying cry for a lot of Russians, kind of giving this existential threat and then showing them that this is the only way out of it. So now moving on to Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church was the predominant religion there. Because of historical reasons, Ukraine had long been kind of the territory of the Russian Orthodox Church for centuries. And Ukraine was of particular importance to the Russian Orthodox Church, with about a third of all parishes actually being located in Ukraine. And a great deal of the clergy and bishops are from there as well. It was by far the largest denomination prior to the war within the country. It's effectively just the Ukrainian branch of the ROC, right? So it's the UOC MP, it's usually called. Now, there have been groups, especially since the end of the Soviet Union, that advocated for Ukraine to have its own Orthodox Church, its own autocephalous Orthodox Church. So, for example, they were complaining about the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church does not allow to have services in Ukrainian. It also felt that, we're an independent country now, we're no longer under the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. Why do we have to have our church under Moscow still? So all those sorts of kinds of debates had been going on for decades up until 2019. So in 2019, if you actually go back one slide, in 2019, right at the end of the year, the Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, seen on the left, granted autocephaly to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the OCU, and that's Metropolitan Epifani, the head of the OCU on the right. And what he's handing him is not a water bottle. It is what's called a tomos. It's the official document that basically grants the autocephaly. It's kind of like your independence declaration that you get, saying that they are a fully autocephalous, self-governing church now. So the Ecumenical Patriarchate's decision to create the OCU should be seen as part of a larger conflict with the Russian Orthodox Church over preeminence and authority within the global Orthodox Church. In 2016, there had been plans years in the making to hold a council of all the Orthodox churches to address important issues. Like I mentioned earlier, there's no way to make a kind of binding decision for all of Orthodoxy without having one of these councils. And they were really, really working towards having one in 2016. Decisions made there would have been significant and a demonstration of unity within the church that we hadn't seen in almost millennia. But right before it happened, several Orthodox churches backed out, with the Russian Orthodox Church eventually deciding not to attend and really putting a death knell to the whole process. Now, after the fact, the Ecumenical Patriarchate blamed the Russian Orthodox Church for the defections from the council. They believed they had put undue pressure on some of the smaller churches to back out first, so it didn't look like Russia was pulling out first. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church countered with accusations that the Ecumenical Patriarch was engaging in papalism, that is, pretensions to be like a Pope of Orthodoxy. And so this is a very powerful rebuke in an Orthodox context. And the feud between these two churches is significant and is a struggle over leadership and kind of directions for how the global Orthodox community and the future of Orthodoxy are going to look. Indeed, because of the decision to grant the Tomos and to create an autocephalous church in Ukraine, Moscow and Constantinople are no longer in communion. So there's a huge schism right now within Orthodoxy. Now, much of Putin's justification for Russia's invasion of Ukraine centers on the narrative that Ukraine's government and policies represent an existential threat to Russia and the Russian people. And inherent in this idea is that Ukraine is looking to subvert the Christian values and replace them with Western liberal ones. Putin stated this explicitly in his speech prior to the invasion, that Orthodox churches were under attack. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church was adamantly opposed to the creation of this autocephalous church, claiming that the Ecumenical Patriarchate just does not have the authority to even do so, and that the decision would be an incursion onto the authority of the ROC. They even claimed that the creation of the OCU was an American plot against Russia, largely kind of masterminded by Mike Pompeo. In response to the creation of the OCU, the Russian Orthodox Church, as I mentioned, broke communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. So you can no longer receive the sacraments if you're a Greek Orthodox believer at a Russian Orthodox church, for example. So that's been a really big kind of break between them. Now, since the invasion, the Ukrainian government has taken a rather harsh measures against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the branch of the ROC within Ukraine. Just recently, the Ukrainian parliament passed a law that bans religious groups with ties to Russia. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, tries to counter this. They claim they have maintained full independence from the Russian Orthodox Church since the war began. They actually had an emergency meeting in May of 2022 in which they claimed that they had no longer any ties, that they were totally separate from Moscow, that they've always supported the war effort, which is true. They do supply humanitarian aid, they supply chaplains, for example. And the passing of this law has been extremely controversial. Many observers around the world have raised issues about it potentially violating religious freedom. To outlaw a religious organization, especially one as large and as prominent as the UOC, affects a huge portion of the population. And all of a sudden disrupts the lives of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, many of whom are actively supporting the war effort, are volunteering at the front. And of course, Russia opposes this move and has used this to claim that Ukraine has no interest in promoting democracy at all, but it's merely just anti-Russian. Can we go 2 slides ahead? So Orthodoxy is not the only major Christian confession within Ukraine. We also have the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And this denomination is predominantly centered in Western Ukraine, in the lands that had been under Austrian control in the past. So the UGCC, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, is a little bit strange to some people. It's a church in full communion with the Pope. It's part of the global Catholic Church, but has a style of worship that is much more similar to Orthodoxy than a typical Catholic Mass. You see here Pope Francis with the major archbishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and you notice that he's wearing a garb that looks more like an Orthodox bishop, for example. Now, the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has been a staunch defender and promoter of Ukrainian culture and language. Russia has often used the connections between the Greek Catholic Church and the Vatican to spur opposition to whatever the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian people are doing. They claim that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church is a conduit through which Western values and culture are smuggled into Ukraine and are then going to infringe upon Russia and are used to undermine the native traditions there. And the connection with the Vatican is often part of a larger conspiratorial thinking and accusations that Russian propaganda makes against the West and the United States. Next slide, please. These religious themes are often quite powerful in convincing people of the necessity for Russian actions and the threat that Western countries supposedly pose to Russia. Now, thinking back to that messianic streak that I mentioned earlier, there's been a longstanding antagonism towards Catholics within Russian culture. And because you have this giant, Eastern Rite church within Ukraine, it's seen as almost like a Trojan horse, if you will, of the Vatican operating so close to Moscow. That, yeah, they look Orthodox, but really they're Catholic underneath it all. And that they are going to use this as a means of subverting the Orthodox Church. In fact, the creation of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church was seen in Russia, way back when it happened in the 17th century, as a kind of means of Poland trying to grab more land. So these kinds of connotations remain to this day. Next slide, please. So in general, the war has been devastating, obviously, for all parts of life, but it's done a great deal of damage to sites of worship, especially churches, some quite historical. There's a great threat to kind of the cultural heritage of Ukraine that people are trying to protect and document, and it's very, very worrisome about what's happening. There have been reports from the World Council of Churches that nearly 500 churches have been damaged in the war. And nearly half of them, 48%, are actually Ukrainian Orthodox Church churches. These are the ones that Russia is claiming to want to defend, that they are in fact bombing. So you see how the kind of waters get muddied here, where on the one hand, there are Ukrainians who are worried that the UOC is operating clandestinely for Russia. On the other hand, you have Russians claiming they're defending the UOC, but actually bombing UOC churches. So it's very, very difficult to kind of get any clarity on the situation there. Next slide, please. Now, shifting now to Jewish communities, one of Putin's major justifications for the war has been his claim to the need to denazify Ukraine. And he based this reasoning on the fact that some Ukrainian nationalist groups have lionized figures who collaborated with the Nazis. This can be seen, for example, in the creation of the Azov Battalion and the rehabilitation of Stepan Bandera. Next slide, please. So the Azov Battalion was formed during Russia's initial annexation of Crimea and its invasion of Eastern Ukraine in 2014 as a means of defending the country. And it was an independent militia originally. It had no official connection with the Ukrainian military, but has since been integrated into it. And even though it's only a very, very, very tiny portion of Ukraine's armed forces, it often gets a lot of press, especially in Russia, because of the imagery and the ideology behind some of its founders. So many of its founders were, in fact, ultra-nationalists or neo-Nazis. You can see this is their symbol here. It's known as a Wolfsangel. It's a Nazi symbol. It's a directly Nazi symbol, unfortunately. So that you're right. There's a grain of truth in the things that Putin talks about, but he of course blows it out of proportion, claiming that this represents all of Ukraine. Next slide, please. Now, Stepan Bandera, the man pictured in the portrait here, was a Ukrainian nationalist leader, especially active during the 40s. He was an active collaborator with the Nazis. When the Nazis came and occupied a lot of Ukraine, he was doing this as a means of breaking free from Soviet rule and hoping that an independent Ukraine would come about. Eventually was arrested and killed by the Soviets. His legacy is very complicated in Ukraine. Some see him as a freedom fighter, some see him as a fascist, and there's others with mixed feelings. So you'll see a lot of times that Putin will refer to the Ukrainian government as Banderites, right? The followers of Bandera. So this is a kind of watchword that Russians understand, meaning someone who would collaborate with the Nazis, someone who was sympathetic to the fascists. So the idea of denazifying Ukraine is extremely appealing to the Russian population, which has a very strong association with the Soviet victory in World War II. This is in fact the kind of central event for Russian identity today, because every single family had some kind of connection to the war. 22 million, roughly, Soviet citizens died in World War II. So everyone has some kind of stake, some kind of personal tie to that victory. And so being able to see yourself as continuing that legacy, to being able to carry on the work that your grandfather or your uncle did in the war and defeating the Nazis is a very powerful rhetorical trope within Russia. Now, for Ukrainians, this strikes as both offensive and incongruous with reality. Ukraine has a Jewish president who had family members who died in the Holocaust. Every single one of his grandfather's siblings died because they were either killed by the Nazis or they were captured by the Nazis, revealed to be Jewish, and sent to concentration camps. Moreover, the Jewish community in Ukraine has been strongly against this insinuation. The chief rabbi of Ukraine, for example, regularly brings aid to the front. And just this past week, his adopted son was killed in the war, and they had a funeral for him. Meanwhile, within Russia itself, there's actually been an upswing in anti-Semitic activities. In the Northern Caucasus, mobs were harassing and assaulting individuals who were believed to be Jewish because they were getting off of a flight from Israel. And the former chief rabbi of Russia left the country 2 weeks after the invasion and urged Jews to leave and follow him, lest they become scapegoats for issues and hardships happening because of the war effort. This former chief rabbi was labeled a foreign agent, which meant that the government basically said that he was receiving money from abroad and that he would be under greater legal scrutiny. And so all of these pressures forced him to leave. Next slide, please. Another moment that undercuts the Russian claims of denazifying were that the Russian bombing damaged the site of Babin Yar outside of Kyiv. Babin Yar is the location of one of the largest mass graves from World War II. the Soviet government worked to cover up the extent of Babyn Yar and to prevent people from using it to speak about the Holocaust. Under the Soviet Union, the sacrifice of the Soviet people and what they gave to win the war was preeminent. And so, talking about the Holocaust was going to detract from that, or so the thinking went. So that's why they just didn't want anyone to even mention this. They didn't want this to be kind of held up as something else that people should be concerned with. So Russia's attacks damaged the site and were reminiscent of Soviet efforts that attacked the memory of the Holocaust. Here we see a before and after of a monument in the shape of a menorah, for example, on the left before and on the right after Russian bombings. So it's a clear example of the offensive nature of the Putin regime's attempts to distort the understanding of World War II and the Holocaust that are so offensive to Ukrainian Jews and Jews around the world. Next slide, please. So moving on to the next religious group, I don't want to neglect the effects of this conflict on Muslim communities either. Ukraine has a sizable indigenous population of Muslims, the Crimean Tatar people. The Crimean Tatars have faced many repressions throughout history. They were deported from Crimea by Stalin in the 1940s, mostly to Central Asia, and were not permitted to return to Crimea until the late 1980s. Since the end of the Soviet Union, there's been a resurgence of Crimean Tatar culture and language, and their traumatic history has been very difficult to overcome. There's been a lot of trying to regain what was lost, reconnect with the past. And Russia's annexation of Crimea, there's been a crackdown on Crimean cultural activists. So people feel like the kind of crimes of the Soviet past are repeating themselves again in Crimea. Next slide, please. Now, with regards to Islam in Russia, Russia has the largest Muslim population of any European country, if you count all of Russia as European. But it does have the largest Muslim population in the region. And it has a very diverse Muslim population. It ranges from the Caucasus to the Volga region, all the way across Siberia. Very different cultures, languages, histories going on. But in the North Caucasus is especially important. So the Chechen people are perhaps some of the best known predominantly Muslim groups in Russia. In the 1990s and early 2000s, Russia fought two very bloody wars against the Chechens who were looking to separate and form an independent country from Russia. The Russian government eventually pacified the region and installed local allies in leadership. They installed the father of this man. His name was Akhmat Kadyrov. His son is now in charge of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov. And the current president, Ramzan Kadyrov, has developed a cult of personality and has really amped up the kind of militaristic language around Islam in his tenure. You can see this cult of personality in the background of the photo. That's his own face superimposed on the Chechen flag. And he often pushes the use of Islam to justify his authoritarian actions. And this is from everything from domestic policy to military policy. He's been a vocal supporter of Russia's war effort against Ukraine and has sent his own personal troops to fight. That's who you see in this photo. He likes to publicize his actions. Here he's seen with a general getting kind of a briefing on what's going on. He claims to have been at the front himself. It's not clear if that's actually true, but he's always trying to be in kind of the limelight, and he's very active on social media. And most important in kind of this connection to how religion is being used here, he's used the language of jihad to describe Russia's war in Ukraine. This is a divine struggle. This is about fighting for, in his view, right, Allah and for the truth of Islam. Next slide, please. Now, the final group I'd like to address is Russia's Buddhist population. And the Buddhists are largely centered in two regions in Russia. Kalmykia here on the Caspian Sea, and Buryatia, and right next to it, Tuva in Eastern Siberia. So looking at Buryatia, Buryatia is a border region with Mongolia. Its indigenous population has long had Buddhism as its main religion. And it's also one of the most economically depressed parts of Russia. It has very high unemployment and very low educational attainment levels. So when the war began, many younger Buryats either joined the military for economic opportunities or were forced into the military because they didn't have the kind of connections or savvy to be able to kind of duck it, and have become a huge part of the fighting force in Ukraine. The government of Buryatia actually was also really aggressive in reaching its drafting quotas that were given to them by Moscow in hopes of getting more, benefits, resources from the central government. Similarly, Kalmykia was the only region in the entire country that actually exceeded its draft target. So many of the Buryat recruits have been sent to the front lines, but they have been extremely poorly trained, and they're often, because of racially motivated policies, put in the most dangerous situations. A lot of the ethnic Russian commanders see them as more expendable because they are from a kind of backwaters, so to speak, and they are, not ethnically Russian. Buryat soldiers have suffered casualties far disproportionate to their numbers in the army as a whole. And 2022, in the summer, saw protests erupt across Russia's Far East, with people speaking out against the use of Buryats and other neighboring ethnic groups in the region that many saw as being used as cannon fodder for an ethnic feud between Russians and Ukrainians. Now, Buddhism, of course, is often associated with nonviolence, and there has been some substantial pushback from believers. Most Buddhist interpretations allow for defensive actions, but offensive war is generally seen as something to be avoided. Next slide, please. The head Lama of Kalmykia even stated in an interview that, quote, "The Ukrainian side is, of course, right. They are defending their country, their land, their truth, their constitution, their people," end quote. Now, shortly after this statement, the Russian government used its favorite tactic and labeled the Lama a foreign agent. So again, he would be under this greater legal scrutiny. He's also actually an American citizen, so that didn't help either. So as a result, he chose to resign his position as the chief Lama. So the Putin regime uses any and all legal tactics it can find to put pressure on religious communities and leaders to get them on board with the government's actions. So overall, my goal here today was to offer you some background and information about the religious situation in Russia and Ukraine and how it impacts the current war. This important cultural topic must be considered when looking to understand the causes and potential outcomes for this conflict. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. Questions? In the back. Hold on, let me get the microphone to you. Okay, try it.
Do you think Putin has the slightest true faith in Christianity himself and reads the Bible and believes in Jesus, or is it all totally political?
I'm going to say like 95% political. If I had to, I don't want to speak. No one knows the inside of someone's head or soul, right? But for the most part, it's an instrumental relationship with Christianity. It's a very expedient and advantageous because it has a built-in history and a built-in support system for it, right? And so it's very easy for him to kind of glom onto. And because Russia has this kind of longer messianic streak that involves the religion, that's a way that his imperial ambitions can really be developed.
Another question? Jeremy, from your end?
Yes, so far, it very much sounds as though Putin is employing the Machiavellian approach to religion, using it to retain power. What evidence is there of his own belief in Eastern Orthodox religion, if any?
Oh, yeah. So this was the question asked in the room as well. So I don't know if you were able to hear it on Zoom.
Oh, okay.
What I said is that it seems largely instrumentalized. It's very, very hard to see any kind of sincerity in anything he does, and especially with regard to religion. It's very much a kind of photo opportunity, way for him to tap into certain belief systems that people already draw upon. And, because we have a long tradition in Russia as well of the government and the religious power being fused. Within, across the imperial period, the Tsar was really the head of the church. The patriarchate was abolished, and the church had become basically a department of the government. So the Tsar was the one who holds both secular and religious power. And so here we're seeing again a sort of reinterpretation of that.
Thank you.
What is the state of Protestantism in Russia today? I know we used to be able to send missionaries only 15 years or so ago. Is that still possible?
I think technically still possible. It has gotten very, very difficult. Basically, any sort of missionary group that gets money and material support from a foreign organization, like a mission organization, right, is going to face that foreign agent law. And so that'll make it extremely difficult to operate. They'll be under intense scrutiny. And if they do anything remotely, like kind of, seeming to go beyond the boundaries of what they're actually on their visa for, it could result in very kind of draconian punitive actions. For example, the Mormon Church was sending missionaries, of course, for decades since the end of the Soviet Union, and then things were getting tighter and tighter, and so they were eventually sending over volunteers who were claiming only to be offering like free English classes, and that was like the extent of what they were allowed to do. They were not allowed to go door to door. They were not allowed to like hand out literature because they didn't have the official visa that let them be missionaries. We've also seen lots of Protestant churches closed within both Russia and Ukraine, especially in the areas of Ukraine that Russia now occupies, especially the Baptist churches. There's a long history of Baptists in Ukraine, and actually probably one of the strongest Protestant traditions in kind of that region of the world. And yeah, the government is really cracking down on that and basically, making it almost impossible for pastors to work, for people to gather to worship, because they're seen as kind of a subversive force.
Jeremy, I think I saw a question on your side.
Yes. Pamela J. Smith asks, how can we counter these ancient belief systems to promote more acceptance and collaboration, if at all? And she thanks you for your informative presentation.
Thank you very much for that question. It's actually very interesting to see the kind of split in how things have gone for Russia and Ukraine over the past 30 some odd years, in understanding kind of how religious freedom and pluralism is accepted and integrated in both countries. Ukraine had long been more religiously diverse than the majority of Russia because of its connections and closer proximity to Western Europe. It had a larger Jewish population just per capita. For example, it had this indigenous Muslim population. So Ukraine had really did a good job of kind of allowing for that religious freedom and pluralism to flourish. There would never been really, until recently, until this banning of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, there had not been a major kind of issue with religious freedom in Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, still had this kind of two-tiered approach, right? It had the four traditional religions that I mentioned that are enumerated in law, and then everyone else. So you have a very clear hierarchy there, where it's orthodoxy at the top, because clearly, that's what the majority of people are Russians. You see Putin at the churches. Then you have the official Muslim, Jewish, and Buddhist groups, and then any other organization. So any other kind of Christian, be it Protestant or Catholic, polytheistic religions, for example. And so there was never really, even if religious freedom was guaranteed, it was never guaranteed in the sense that all were equal before the law. It was just that all were mostly tolerated until a certain point. And then you get things like the Jehovah's Witnesses being banned and Mormon missionaries having a difficult time even being missionaries, things like that.
How effective would you say the message? I know you started to look at really the messaging that is being done. Is how sophisticated and how effective would you rate it?
I think it's quite sophisticated. They don't lack for resources, the Russian government or the Russian Orthodox Church, really. And so they are able to put together, pretty effective and pretty convincing media programs that are able to get this message out there and to get people to kind of understand their point of view. From the other reason why it's pretty effective is because there is no more independent media in Russia. With the war starting in 2022, there new laws were passed that made it illegal to question or defame the war effort, the military efforts. And so you have all independent media that still existed, and there was very few left anyway, either entirely closing up or basically decamping to countries like Latvia or Poland. Not being able to kind of get their message out there unless you use a VPN and go online and go around certain blocks in Russia. And so being able to really control the media space has enabled, the message to become kind of the only message and thus increasing its efficacy.
Jeremy, another question on your end?
Yes, what's the effect on the Orthodox Church if the war drags on, tens of thousands more are killed week by week, and the church is seen as having, in Russia, supported the regime and the war? Is this likely to disillusion the population completely? The church, I think you mentioned, was down to about 2% of the population, although those are visibly very devout in the churches. The few, but very intense in their religiosity. But is this going to really spell the end of the active Orthodox Church in Russia over the long run?
It's a great question. It's not. I'm not sure if it could totally erode that because of the long history and the other institutional factors that kind of play a role here, right? Like even if you're not very religious, you still kind of cross yourself when you pass by a church, for example, or you still might have an icon in your corner because that's what your mom did and your grandmother did and your great grandmother did. It's just kind of baked into the culture. So I don't know if it would totally erode and totally destroy all kind of church adherence or belief. But what is definitely happening is that its global impact is starting to fray. So already, right, what we're seeing in Ukraine, where you had so many of the parishes located trying to totally distance itself from Russia. They don't want to claim autocephaly because that's a step too far for them, but they also don't want to be associated with Moscow anymore. You're seeing other countries start to think about banning the Russian Orthodox Church. So Moldova has recently passed a law doing so because Moldova, again, historically, because of its place within the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union, was also under the Russian Orthodox Church. So we're seeing that those issues start to happen as well. And there's just a larger kind of secularization happening too that might give, less and less kind of moral authority to the church and to what the patriarch says. Meanwhile, the patriarch himself is doubling down. He has, initially in 2014, right? So if we think of this war as really beginning in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and with the kind of Eastern Ukrainian separatist republics declaring independence, Patriarch Kirill actually tried to distance himself a bit and say, okay, yes, Crimea is part of Russia, but the parishes of Crimea and the diocese of Crimea will remain in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because I'm not getting involved in that. Eventually, he did integrate them into the Russian Orthodox Church. Now, fast forward to today, and that is gone. There is no kind of couching these things in more nuanced language. There's no idea of trying to placate people on both sides. He is all in on behalf of the Russian military. Like I mentioned, he's called this a holy war. He banned priests from saying prayers for peace in Ukraine. They can only pray for victory of Russia in Ukraine now. So that's where we're at with him.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Same sort of card that Putin could play in Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, the Caucasus, etc., after Ukraine, if it comes to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we think about the 2008 invasion of, the 2008 invasion of Georgia is, partially responsible for why I'm here today, right? So I started college in the summer of 2008. I wanted to take German. It was full. I took Russian instead. It had been on the news a lot. Here we are today. But if we think about the 2008 invasion of Ukraine as a kind of a dress of Georgia as almost a dress rehearsal for what happened, right? How far can Russia go in, quote unquote, supporting separatists and in occupying land of a sovereign nation, and the international community doesn't push back or doesn't do much because they're worried about nuclear escalation, for example. And we see the same thing happening, right, with 2014 in Ukraine. And we also saw the same thing in the 90s and up until today with the region of Transnistria between Ukraine or between Moldova and Ukraine, right? This is a very small part of Moldova that broke away in the immediate post-Soviet period from independent Moldova because they basically wanted the Soviet Union to keep going on. And Russia defends its de facto independence. And basically it was propped up because Russia would give it gas at an extremely low rate, if anything, if they even charged for it. And then then Transnistria would sell it to Romania, Moldova, Bulgaria for way under market price. So like Moldova actually paid for its own separatist region to keep existing, basically. And so we have these kinds of other frozen conflicts, so to speak, happening. And so absolutely, the biggest worry right now, at least especially from NATO partners, is the Baltic countries. Is Russia going to move into Estonia, for example, which has the largest of the three of a Russian-speaking population? The patriarch actually is from Estonia originally. Another question is northern Kazakhstan, which has a strong and large ethnic Russian population.
Any other questions on your end, Jeremy?
Yes, I'm interested in the Crimean Tatars. The Russians, of course, have claimed Crimea as theirs for 300 years or so. But the Crimean Tatars are a substantial minority. Is there any sign of restiveness on their part? Or have some of them fled to Ukraine? What's their standing inside Crimea?
Yeah, a large number of them have now become internally displaced into different parts of Ukraine. The ones who have stayed have been severely repressed. Like if there's any of that restiveness, like you mentioned, has been dealt with swiftly, and you see long jail sentences for prominent members of the Crimean Tatar community. So yeah, so it's very much a kind of second forced deportation in a way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, with that, another hand for Dr. Lassin.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lassin. Again, want to remind you, let me get the date just to make sure. The next thing will be September 29th, and that'll be at the Davis Theater, 3 p.m. Next door for a free event, Beyond the War, which I think, again, reconciliation of former enemies, both of whom have found their way to heading major universities. And then October 22nd, Dr. Elizabeth Pfeiffer on extremist groups and information warfare. And November 19th, Dr. Christopher Colley on Chinese influence in the Pacific region. Thank you again for coming out and joining us tonight. It's good to be back into the swing of a season at the Alabama World Affairs Council. Safe travels. Thank you.